For most of his life, Lindsey Buckingham could trust one thing. His hands might shake from exhaustion, relationships could collapse, bands could split apart, people could stop returning phone calls. But when he opened his mouth to sing, the voice was there. Until one day, it wasn't. In early 2019, Buckingham underwent emergency open-heart surgery. The operation saved his life, but afterward came a complication nobody in his family had expected. During the procedure, his vocal cords were damaged by the intubation. Think about that for a moment. This was not simply a singer waking up hoarse after surgery. This was a man who had spent nearly half a century turning private pain into sound, suddenly discovering that the instrument he carried inside his own body might no longer obey him. And the timing was cruel, because Lindsey Buckingham had already lost something enormous before he ever entered that hospital. Fleetwood Mac, not the music, not the memories, his place inside it. Less than a year earlier, Buckingham had been dismissed from the band he helped transform into one of the biggest musical forces of the 20th century. Depending on whose version you believe, there were disagreements over touring, personality, scheduling, old tensions, perhaps all of it at once. Fans wanted one clean explanation. Rock history usually prefers one: a betrayal, a villain, a final argument. But relationships that survive 4 decades rarely break for only one reason. That is the part I think gets flattened when this story is told too quickly. By 2018, Lindsey Buckingham and Fleetwood Mac were not simply co-workers disagreeing about a tour. They were people carrying 40 years of unresolved history into every rehearsal room, and suddenly, Buckingham was outside. He later described the experience as something he felt almost physically. For months, the rejection stayed with him. Then came the heart surgery, then the voice. If you grew up hearing Fleetwood Mac on the radio, it may be difficult to imagine Buckingham without that sound. His voice was never polished in the traditional sense. That was part of the appeal. There was tension in it, urgency, something slightly restless. You could hear a Lindsey Buckingham vocal and know almost immediately that nobody else quite phrased words that way. Now he had to wonder whether that part of himself had survived the operating room. His wife at the time, Kristen Buckingham, publicly revealed that although the surgery had been successful, the damage to his vocal cords had left him unable to sing normally. There was no dramatic announcement from Lindsey himself, no farewell tour, no carefully lit television interview explaining what had been taken away. Just uncertainty, and sometimes uncertainty is worse, because a final answer at least gives you something to fight against. This gave him nothing except waiting. He sought treatment. He worked with specialists. He began vocal therapy. Slowly, carefully, the voice started coming back. But listen closely to what makes this moment unusual. Buckingham had built much of his adult identity around control. Control in the studio. Control over arrangements. Control over tiny guitar parts other musicians might have accepted after one take. Control over the strange experiments that helped make albums like Tusk sound unlike anything Fleetwood Mac had done before. People called him obsessive. Sometimes they were right. He could be difficult, demanding, stubborn. But now none of that mattered. You cannot argue a damaged vocal cord into healing faster. You cannot produce your own body the way you produce a record. For once, Lindsey Buckingham had to wait for something he could not force. And I suspect that matters more than it appears, because this was not the first time his life had been defined by something slipping beyond his control. Long before Fleetwood Mac became stadium-sized, long before rumors sold millions of copies, long before he and Stevie Nicks could barely look at each other without an audience searching their faces for hidden meaning, there had been just 2 young musicians, Lindsey and Stevie. No empire, no famous breakup, no decades of resentment. Just 2 people trying to make enough money, make enough music, and somehow convince themselves that what they were building together would survive. It almost didn't. And to understand why losing his voice in 2019 cut so deeply, you have to go back to the time when Lindsey Buckingham had very little except that voice, a guitar, and the woman whose life would remain tangled with his for more than 50 years. Before Fleetwood Mac, before the private jets and sold-out arenas, Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks were simply trying to survive. That version of them is easy to forget. By the early 1970s, they had already spent years together, first crossing paths in California and eventually building a musical partnership that became increasingly inseparable from their romantic relationship. They were ambitious, but ambition does not pay rent. And talent does not automatically make people listen. Their first major attempt at breaking through came with the album Buckingham, released in 1973. Today, fans treat that record almost like a lost artifact. At the time, it was a commercial disappointment. That difference matters, because we tend to look backward at famous people and imagine destiny was obvious. It wasn't. Lindsey and Stevie did not know Fleetwood Mac was waiting around the corner. They did not know millions of people would eventually study their expressions on stage. They knew only that the record had not worked. Stevie took jobs to help support them. Lindsey continued obsessing over music, guitar parts, arrangements, possibilities, and there is something uncomfortable in that imbalance. She was helping keep their life afloat while he protected the dream. You can interpret that as devotion. You can also imagine the pressure it created. This is where their story becomes more interesting than the familiar two young lovers become rock stars version. They were not merely in love. They were professionally dependent on each other, emotionally dependent too. Success, money, identity, romance, all of it became tangled together before either of them had the experience to understand how dangerous that could become. Then Mick Fleetwood heard Lindsey play. The famous story is that Fleetwood was looking for a guitarist after another lineup change and became interested in Buckingham. But Lindsey made something clear. If he joined Fleetwood Mac, Stevie came with him. That detail is usually told as romantic loyalty, and it was. But there is another way to see it. Lindsey understood that separating the partnership might destroy the very thing they had spent years building. So in 1975, they entered Fleetwood Mac together. Almost immediately, the scale changed. The band's self-titled album became enormously successful. Songs such as Rhiannon and Landslide helped turn Stevie into a magnetic new presence, while Lindsey's guitar work, arranging instincts, and studio imagination became central to the group's evolving sound. Suddenly, the couple who had struggled to get people to notice them could barely escape attention, and success did something failure had not. It gave both of them choices. That may have been the beginning of the real problem. When you have nothing, staying together can feel necessary. When everything arrives at once, necessity disappears. The relationship began deteriorating under touring, fame, jealousy, exhaustion, and the strange pressure of watching the person beside you become famous independently of you. Imagine experiencing that while working in the same band. No clean separation, no disappearing from each other's lives. No ordinary breakup where someone moves out and stops calling. They still had rehearsals, interviews, studio sessions, concerts. Every emotional wound had to coexist with a professional obligation. And then, Fleetwood Mac began making the album that would turn their private collapse into something almost permanent. Rumors. Millions would eventually hear Lindsey and Stevie sing about each other. What listeners could not fully hear yet was the cost of having to stand only a few feet apart while doing it. By the time Fleetwood Mac began recording Rumors, the band was becoming more successful at almost the exact moment its private relationships were falling apart. That contradiction gave the album its electricity, but it also created something much harsher than the mythology suggests. Lindsey Buckingham was not simply writing breakup songs. He was arranging them, producing them, rehearsing them, and then standing beside the person they were about. Go Your Own Way was unmistakably his. Angry, defensive, hurt. Stevie Nicks would later object to one of its most pointed lines, believing it portrayed her unfairly. Lindsey kept it. That small decision says a great deal. They were no longer having their arguments privately. Millions of strangers were eventually going to hear them, and Stevie had her own answer. Dreams. Calmer on the surface, almost detached. But listen to those songs back to back, and something becomes obvious. They were speaking to each other through records because ordinary conversation no longer seemed capable of carrying everything. This is where I think the usual story gets romanticized. People love saying that heartbreak produced great art. That sounds beautiful after the pain is over. But Lindsey and Stevie were not looking backward yet. They were still inside it. They had to walk into the same studio, hear each other's lyrics, add harmonies to accusations, then perform those songs night after night while audiences cheered. If you bought Rumours in 1977, maybe you remember placing that record on a turntable for the first time. Maybe those songs became part of your own marriage, your own breakup, your own memories. For Lindsey, there was nowhere to hide inside them. Success only made the situation stranger. Rumours became one of the defining albums of its generation. The bigger it became, the more permanent their private pain became too. Every radio station replayed it. Every tour revived it. Every new generation discovered the same wounds. And Lindsey did something revealing afterward. Instead of trying to recreate Rumours exactly, he pushed Fleetwood Mac towards something riskier. Tusk, more experimental, less comfortable, far less predictable. Some saw it as arrogance. Others saw genius. I think there was something else buried in that decision. Lindsey had just watched the most painful period of his personal life become one of the most commercially successful things he would ever create. Perhaps repeating it felt impossible, perhaps even dangerous, so he moved in the opposite direction, and that instinct to disrupt things just when everyone wanted stability would follow him for decades. Sometimes it produced extraordinary music. Sometimes it cost him dearly. Tusk is often treated like the moment Lindsey Buckingham became difficult. That is too simple. By 1979, Fleetwood Mac had every reason to repeat the formula that made Rumours enormous. The industry wanted another polished blockbuster. The audience probably did too. Lindsey wanted something stranger. He recorded parts in unconventional ways, pushed arrangements into unusual shapes, and seemed almost determined to resist the expectation that success should automatically be duplicated. People around him did not always appreciate it, and this is where the public image of Lindsey began to harden. Perfectionist, controlling, temperamental. The difficult genius in a band already overflowing with difficult personalities. Some of that reputation was earned. He could become consumed by details other people thought were finished. He could push harder than collaborators wanted. He did not always make disagreement easy, but there is another interpretation. Lindsey had spent years watching things change without his permission. His relationship with Stevie, the emotional balance inside Fleetwood Mac, the sudden scale of fame. Perhaps the studio became the one place where he believed uncertainty could still be managed. Not his relationships, not other people. A snare sound, a guitar part, an arrangement. Those could be controlled. That does not excuse everything, but it explains something, and the pattern kept repeating. During the making of Tango in the Night in the 1980s, Lindsey again became deeply involved in shaping the music. The album eventually produced major hits, yet the atmosphere behind it was anything but easy. Then, in 1987, Buckingham walked away from Fleetwood Mac before the tour. For years, people interpreted that exit as another example of Lindsey refusing to cooperate. Maybe it was partly that, but by then he had spent more than a decade inside a band where old romances, resentments, business decisions and creative arguments never fully disappeared. At some point, leaving may have felt less like abandoning Fleetwood Mac and more like trying to preserve something of himself outside it. There is a detail worth noticing here. He left when the band was still hugely valuable. That matters. People usually imagine ambition as wanting more fame, more money, more applause. Lindsey sometimes seemed frightened by the cost of getting exactly those things, so he stepped away. Not permanently, as history would prove. Fleetwood Mac had a strange gravitational pull. The members separated, reunited, argued, performed together again, then drifted apart. Lindsey returned for the dance in 1997, and suddenly millions of fans were watching him and Stevie share a stage again. Older now, more controlled, but not emotionally neutral. You could see audiences searching their faces. Was there still anger, affection, regret? Probably some combination nobody outside the two of them could fully understand. And that is the mistake people often make with Lindsey Buckingham. They try to reduce him to one thing: the angry ex, the brilliant guitarist, the difficult bandmate, the perfectionist. But those labels become less useful the longer you follow the story, because the same man who repeatedly pushed people away also kept returning. The same man who demanded independence never completely escaped the people who had defined his life. And eventually, one of those returns would end very differently. This time, Lindsey would not be the one choosing to leave. There are departures you choose, and then there are departures chosen for you. For Lindsey Buckingham, 2018 belonged to the second category. After decades of breakups, reunions, arguments, tours, reconciliations, and uneasy compromises, Fleetwood Mac decided to continue without him. Even now, that sentence sounds strange. This was not a guitarist who had spent a few years passing through the band. Lindsey had helped shape the version of Fleetwood Mac that millions of people still picture first. His guitar was woven into Go Your Own Way. His production instincts had helped define Rumours. His restless imagination had pushed the band toward Tusk. Yet suddenly, he was outside again. Only this time he had not walked away. Buckingham later said he learned through the band's manager that Fleetwood Mac would continue without him. He described the aftermath in deeply physical terms, as though rejection had settled somewhere inside his body. That reaction deserves attention, because Lindsey Buckingham had left Fleetwood Mac before. In 1987, he had been the one making the decision. There is control in leaving first. There is almost none in being told you are no longer wanted. And for a man whose entire creative life had revolved around control, the difference must have been enormous. Publicly, people immediately looked for a simple explanation. Was it Stevie? Was it the touring schedule? Was Lindsey impossible to work with? Had decades of resentment finally reached a breaking point? There were competing accounts, and the disagreement eventually became legal. Buckingham sued members of Fleetwood Mac, and the dispute was later settled. Fans did what fans usually do, they picked sides. But I am not sure choosing a villain gets us very far here. Think about the people involved. They had spent more than 40 years carrying old romances, divorces, addictions, artistic battles, money, jealousy, loyalty, and grief through the same rooms. Most families struggle to survive a fraction of that. Fleetwood Mac had turned it into a business. Perhaps the astonishing thing is not that they finally broke apart again. Perhaps it is that they lasted as long as they did. Still, Lindsey's dismissal carried a particular cruelty. He was approaching 70. The years ahead suddenly looked shorter than the years behind him. That changes the emotional mathematics. When you are 30, a broken relationship can feel temporary, even when it seems catastrophic. There is always some vague assumption that life will provide another chapter. At 68, you know better. There may not be another tour. There may not be another reunion. There may not be another conversation where everyone finally says what should have been said 20 years earlier. And Lindsey had already lived through enough reunions to know how easily people mistake later for a guarantee. Fleetwood Mac replaced him on tour with Mike Campbell and Neil Finn. The machine kept moving. That must have been one of the hardest parts. The songs were still played. The audiences still came. The name remained on the marquee. Lindsey Buckingham was simply no longer standing there. For anyone who has ever retired unexpectedly, been replaced at work, watched a family continue without them, or realized that a place they considered permanent could exist perfectly well in their absence. There is something painfully recognizable about that. Identity can be dangerous when we build too much of it around belonging somewhere. Lindsey had spent decades insisting that he was more than Fleetwood Mac. Now he was being forced to prove it. And then, before there was enough time to understand what this new life would look like, his body interrupted the argument entirely. Only months later, Lindsey Buckingham would be rushed into emergency heart surgery. Fleetwood Mac suddenly seemed like the smaller problem, because when he woke up, alive but changed, another part of his identity had been damaged, the voice. And this time there was nobody to sue, nobody to blame, no band meeting that could reverse the decision. Just Lindsey, waiting to find out whether the sound people had known for nearly 50 years would ever truly come back. The surgery saved Lindsey Buckingham's life, but when he woke up, something essential had changed. In 2019, Lindsey underwent emergency open heart surgery. The procedure itself was successful, but during the operation, the intubation damaged his vocal cords. For a man who had spent nearly his entire adult life singing, that complication was terrifying. His voice was suddenly weak and altered, and nobody could immediately tell him exactly how much of it would return. That detail matters because Lindsey Buckingham had always been associated with control. He could obsess over a guitar part, change an arrangement repeatedly, push a recording until it matched whatever he was hearing in his head. But recovery did not care about perfectionism. He had to wait. He worked with specialists and underwent vocal therapy. Slowly, the voice improved. Eventually, Lindsey was able to sing again. It sounds like the perfect comeback. Except aging rarely gives stories such clean endings. Because while Lindsey was recovering, another truth was becoming harder to ignore. Fleetwood Mac was no longer simply a band with unresolved disagreements. It was becoming a group of people running out of time. Christine McVie had always occupied a different place in Lindsey's life. Their musical connection was unusually natural, and in 2017 they released Lindsey Buckingham Christine McVie together. Mick Fleetwood and John McVie also played on the record, making it feel almost like a Fleetwood Mac album, without the full emotional burden attached to the name. Looking back, there is something tender about that project. No huge public feud, no need to turn every song into another chapter of Lindsey and Stevie. Just two longtime musicians enjoying what they still knew how to do together. Then Christine died in November 2022. She was 79. Lindsey called her his musical comrade and soulmate. And suddenly, Fleetwood Mac's unfinished business felt different. For decades, there had always been another possibility, another reunion, another tour, another conversation. Even after arguments, there was still the assumption that everyone remained somewhere in the world, available for one more attempt. Christine's death destroyed that illusion. There would never again be a reunion of the Classic Five. That version of Fleetwood Mac was gone permanently. And if you have lived long enough, you probably understand why that realization can hurt more than the argument itself. People assume there will be time. Time to apologize. Time to call. Time to say something differently. Then someone disappears, and all those imaginary future conversations disappear with them. For Lindsey, one relationship remained especially unfinished. Stevie Nicks. After everything between them, love, betrayal, fame, songs, decades of tension, the distance after 2018 had seemed almost final. They were no longer young enough to believe time was unlimited. Christine was gone. Fleetwood Mac appeared to be over. It would have been easy to assume Lindsey and Stevie would simply remain apart, but something unexpected was beginning to happen. More than 50 years after Buckingham Nicks had failed to find an audience, that old record was returning, and with it came a possibility few people seriously expected anymore. Lindsey and Stevie were beginning to speak again. For years, people assumed they already knew how the Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks story would end. Not together, not even particularly close. Just two people permanently attached by old photographs, old songs, and a relationship that had become almost impossible to separate from the mythology surrounding Fleetwood Mac. After Lindsey's departure from the band in 2018, that ending seemed even more likely. Whatever connection remained between them appeared buried beneath decades of arguments, conflicting memories, resentment, and the kind of emotional exhaustion that usually comes when two people have been explaining the same wounds for far too long. And maybe that would have been understandable. Not every relationship is repaired. Some simply become history. But history has an odd habit of returning when people least expect it. In 2025, Buckingham Nicks, the album Lindsey and Stevie released together in 1973, was finally given the official reissue fans had wanted for decades. That record had once represented disappointment. It had failed commercially when they needed success most. They were young then, struggling, unsure whether anyone beyond a small circle would ever care about the music they were making. Lindsey and Stevie could not possibly have known that the album would later become almost legendary precisely because it remained unavailable for so long. 50 years changed its meaning. What once looked like evidence that they had failed became proof of who they were before everything became complicated. Before rumors, before stadiums, before public breakups, before everybody had a favorite version of what went wrong. Just Lindsey, Stevie, two voices, and a record almost nobody bought. That is why its return mattered, not simply because collectors wanted it. The album forced both of them to look again at the point where their shared story had begun. and Lindsey began speaking publicly about Stevie in a noticeably different way. By 2026, he said that the work surrounding the Fleetwood Mac documentary had created what he described as a healing process between them. That word deserves some attention. Healing. Not forgetting, not rewriting, not pretending the painful years never happened. Healing is something different. It admits the wound existed. It simply refuses to let the wound remain the only thing that matters. For decades, Lindsey and Stevie often seemed trapped inside versions of themselves created when they were much younger. He was the difficult one. She was the wounded one. He was controlling, she was unforgiving. Then the roles would reverse depending on who was telling the story. Fans chose sides. Magazine headlines chose sides. Sometimes Lindsey and Stevie seemed to choose sides against each other. But age has a way of making those old categories feel smaller. Nobody involved is 30 anymore. Nobody needs Fleetwood Mac to prove that they mattered. Nobody needs rumors to sell another 20 million copies. And perhaps most importantly, Christine McVie is no longer there. That changes everything. Christine's death removed one possibility permanently. There would never again be another reunion of that classic 5-person lineup. No future photograph with all of them standing together. No later tour where everybody finally put the arguments aside. That option simply disappeared. And when one possibility disappears forever, the others can suddenly look more precious. I think that is where Lindsey's story becomes deeply relatable to people who have lived long enough to lose someone. When we are younger, we treat relationships as if time is unlimited. You can stay angry another year. You can postpone the call. You can wait until Christmas. Wait until somebody apologizes first. Wait until the timing feels right. Then one day you learn the cruelest lesson adulthood eventually teaches almost everyone. Sometimes there is no later. Christine was Lindsey's musical partner, friend, and one of the few people who seemed able to work beside him without every interaction becoming part of a larger drama. When she died, there was no final chance to make another album. That kind of loss has a way of reorganizing priorities. So when Lindsey speaks now about reconnecting with Stevie, I do not hear a conventional celebrity reunion story. I hear something quieter. Two people realizing the clock is no longer theoretical. They spent more than 50 years connected. Sometimes through love, sometimes through anger, sometimes only through songs they had written about each other decades earlier and were still expected to perform. And now they are talking again. That may sound small compared with a reunion tour. It isn't. For Lindsey Buckingham, conversation with Stevie may actually be more meaningful than standing beside her under stage lights. A concert would satisfy fans. A conversation might satisfy something far older. There is also another detail worth noticing. Lindsey is still working. He has spoken about a new solo album, saying he has been developing it for years and is close to completing it. That matters because there is something deeply Lindsey-like about the idea of him still adjusting songs in his 70s, still listening, still changing things, still believing the next record deserves his attention. The man who once drove bandmates crazy because a guitar part was not quite right apparently still hears possibilities. And when asked whether something musical could happen again with Stevie, he did not close the door. He suggested possibilities remained. That does not mean Buckingham Nicks is suddenly going on tour. It does not mean Fleetwood Mac is coming back. We should resist turning one hopeful comment into a fantasy ending, because that would miss the point. The important thing is that Lindsey no longer seems to speak as though every old door must remain locked. Maybe something happens. Maybe nothing does. At 76, the possibility itself carries weight. Think about how strange that is. The young Lindsey once insisted Stevie join Fleetwood Mac with him. Later, they could barely remain in the same relationship. Then they spent decades repeatedly leaving and returning to one another's orbit. And now, after heart surgery, after losing his voice temporarily, after being removed from Fleetwood Mac, after losing Christine, Lindsey Buckingham is still here, not untouched, not reconciled with every piece of the past, but here. And perhaps the tragedy of Lindsey Buckingham was never simply that painful things happened to him. His life contained something more complicated than that. Again and again, the people and things he loved became things he tried to control. The band, the music, the relationship, even the narrative of what had happened, and control worked beautifully in the studio. It created extraordinary records, but people are not records. You cannot keep recording another take until a relationship becomes perfect. You cannot remix 20 years of resentment. You cannot erase something painful, because the arrangement would sound better without it. Eventually, you either carry it forever, or you put some of it down. Maybe that is what we are finally watching Lindsey do. If you were there when Rumours was new, you have grown older with these people. The songs stayed the same, you did not. Neither did Lindsey, and neither did Stevie. The anger that felt enormous in 1977 looks different when viewed from the other side of 70. There are fewer years ahead, more empty chairs behind you, different questions. Not who was right, but was all of that really worth carrying this long? Lindsey Buckingham may never completely answer that. He probably shouldn't. Some stories become less truthful when everything is neatly resolved. But at 76, he is still making music, still looking forward, still speaking to someone who once seemed permanently lost to him. And after everything that happened between Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks, perhaps the most surprising chapter is not that they loved each other, not that they hurt each other, not even that they spent decades turning those wounds into songs. It is that after more than half a century, neither of them has completely disappeared from the other's life. The road Lindsey told Stevie to take all those years ago was supposed to lead away. Instead, somehow, it keeps circling back.